Well, recently, New City Church has turned 6 years old. And so today on Practical Church Planting, we're going to share with you 6 reflections as New City Church turns 6.
Welcome to Practical Church Planting. My name is Brian Brammer, and with me today is Dylan Dodson. And our topic for this episode is 6 church planting reflections as New City turns 6. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday. As we're recording this the day before we turned 6 years old. And it's always really cool, especially during the first service, during the first worship songs before the sermon. It's always just a very reflective time for me of just thinking through these last 6 years and what it's been like, and learned a lot of things through the years. God's been kind. We celebrated baptisms, and we do a little video every year. People think, people are impacted by New City, and we give away free shirts for the first time, which we'll talk about at staff. I don't know. I mean, it was good. I don't know that we'll do it again in terms of us paying for them. Maybe not. But it was really cool, and a lot of New City shirts. Got to be careful how you say that. Are floating out in the wild now because of that.
I think we had maybe 10 left over, so we.
Yeah, it's all relative. I mean, just for numbers, you might find this interesting. We ordered 128 shirts, no kids sizes, so it was small through double XL, and 114 of them were taken. Now, some of the sizes ran out, and then we have some sizes left over of other ones. So perhaps if we had unlimited of all the sizes, we would know exactly for sure. But it worked out well for us. So 114 people took a shirt, and or 114 adults, I should say, took a shirt. And
we had socks the previous week.
We had socks 2 weeks ago.
Was it 2 weeks ago? Okay, we're just providing the wardrobe.
Swagging out. Swagging out.
If you need to fill out your closet,
I will say this, though. I mean, just for practical sake, the church shirts were way more expensive than socks. We ordered 100 socks, and they were all gone. Now, again, it's kind of relative on size. I didn't think new people would take them. I didn't think many. I thought there would be a lot of people that I don't really care about socks, but we ordered crew socks, and everybody wanted them. Yeah. And people were asking for extras, or if you're asking can I get one? I'm we literally have none left. So socks were more inexpensive, and everybody people are wearing them all the time. I've seen people that got their socks on. So anyway, if you're looking for ideas, socks are cheaper than shirts, but they're both pretty cool. So. All right, number 1, 6 reflections on 6 years. Developing a preaching rhythm takes time. So one of the things we talk about often on this episode or on this podcast is just rhythms and practices, like organizing your calendar and your schedule in such a way that you're not always unscheduled and stressed out and all these sort of things. And so we've talked a lot about preaching rhythms and we've got episodes where we're talking about mine and that sort of thing of how I do mine. And so we talk about it's important to have a rhythm, so you're not wondering week to week when you're going to get it done. But also on the flip side, I want to encourage you that it does take time to develop this. So, for me, for example, I've been preaching almost every week for 6+ years now, and so it's really fine tuned. I know it works for me. Sometimes when people talk about when they preach every so often, and they talk about how man, I can't believe somebody does this every week. I always want to say that's true, but also when somebody does it every week, it's not as much, I don't know what the word I'm trying to say is, effort. Yeah. Because you have a lot more skill developed in writing a sermon. So I always want to say that, especially if you're newer to this or you don't preach so often and you're kind of wondering how people do it well, part of it is they've got a rhythm and you figure it over time. So I just want to say this. It does take time, but you do want to try things out to get to a rhythm, particularly if you preach somewhat consistently. Put it on your calendar. Here's when I'm studying. Here's when I'm writing. And tweak it. You can expand the hours, decrease the hours. But I would just highly encourage working on a rhythm that you're going to do the same time, the same place, the same way every single week, and tweaking that as you go, because you won't just fall into a rhythm. So it would be wrong to assume, well, after I preach for a while, I'll just kind of figure it out, because I know a lot of guys that have preached for a while, and on Saturday night they're still putting their sermon together because they haven't, been proactive and intentional with how they spend their time. So developing a preaching rhythm is really important, but it does take time. My encouragement is to try different things, but be really disciplined on doing it at the same times, the same week or the same days, so that you can kind of see what works for you, what doesn't.
Well, and the important thing is your rhythm. Right. So I attended seminary. I got my MDiv, 2009. And so now I'm in ministry. So that's how long I've been disobedient. Just trying to figure stuff out, how God would to use me. And I honestly, when this isn't throwing shade at any of the professors there or anything, right, but I had heard it was per sermon, you need to be putting in at least 20, 25 hours. And it's just it's just not realistic. Mm-hmm. Again, if that's maybe if you're a teaching pastor, and that's your own
Right.
responsibility. But I don't even see that at the church planting level. Like that's
Right.
a lot higher, where you've got maybe 10 pastors on staff and you've got one that mainly preaches and they can dedicate that much time to it. So find these rhythms that work best for you. Some people can just absorb information quicker. I'm not one of those. For me, so I'm preaching at the end of April, and it takes me a bit to get going.
Yeah.
But then once I got going, I got that this was just like a rhythm in one sermon.
Right.
It kind of just started flowing together. So then imagine doing that over and over again. If your time gets shorter in preparation, don't think it as, oh, this sermon's not going to be as blessed because I spent less time. Like God's not, just like he doesn't cheer for a certain football team, believe it or not, no sports teams, but he's not going to like be pleased because you spent 20 hours as opposed to 10. So that's a bad, I'd say that's not the best metric. Maybe if you're starting, you kind of want to keep track of that.
Right.
And then as it goes on, you find maybe it's shortened that time, or maybe doing it 2 days back to back, or just once a week works best for you. It's really just, I'd say, track that for your own progression to see what works best for you.
Yeah. See what makes it most enjoyable for you, and do it that way. I would totally agree. 20 hours is way too long. I mean, it is way too long for a sermon. And partially now because we have a lot of digital tools that can save us time in terms of I use Logos I've got like all my biblical commentaries and Logos, so it's like I'm not having to open up all these books and find it. We have the internet, so we can like search out passages way quicker. If you're like, wait, what's the verse that says this? And you can like type in a few words and like it comes up.
Yeah.
And also like, it just is not going to get any better. I would recommend 10 to 15 hours. I mean, maybe 15 when you're starting out. I wouldn't go more than that. I would put on your calendar when you're working on it. It's not going to get 15 to 20 hours. Like the 5 more hours is not going to make it any better. I mean, it's probably not. And I think it probably, if anything, is going to make it worse. And so, and a lot of this is different. If cultural context, how long you preach, that sort of thing. In the West, particularly in America, wouldn't generally recommend you preach more than 40 minutes, and for most people, probably 30 minutes until you really figure out what you're doing. Just because, the cultural moment that we lived in. I'm not saying like an hour is bad. It's just for our cultural moment, it seems to be, that seems to be a good sweet spot for now. But developing a rhythm, I would argue the lesser time you spend, the better. But if it's more focused, you actually get it done. So some people that might be working 20 hours is because, they check their email 3 times an hour, and they're on their phone and they're checking texts. And like, that's why it's taking so much time, because you're not focused on it. So I would, again, put on your calendar, here are the hours and times I'm working on it. And the hours and times that I'm working on it, I don't check all these other things, so that I can actually focus on it and get things done. So yeah, developing a preaching rhythm, it takes time, but you want to be intentional with it because it will help you reduce stress. Certainly, I think it was our previous episode too, how to reduce stress in ministry over the long haul, because like your brain, you just trust your process. And not every sermon is going to be amazing, but it's going to be good enough. And then you can focus your time on doing some other things. So developing a preaching rhythm takes time, but you want to do it. And that's a big thing I've learned over these last 6 years. Number 2, be proactive about meeting with your people. I was telling Brian before we recorded. I think part of it was just the church background I grew up in, / everyone says that they're busy. Not that these pastors necessarily use those words, but like everyone just assumes everybody's quote unquote busy. And so I grew up the church I grew up going to as a kid was really large by the time I left. And then in college, I was a part of a large church. And then before my residency, I was also part of a larger church. And so because especially if it's a larger church, people want to meet with the pastor, talk with the pastor. So I think, all that to say, I think when we planted a new city, I just assumed like people would want to meet all the time. Now, granted, we didn't have tons of people, so that's part of it. And like it didn't happen. It's not people were like not like asking to meet very often. And so I think some of that is people, their church backgrounds make a difference. So if they're not used to like having a pastor meet with them, then they're not going to ask for one. Yeah. I also we were young. I didn't have a lot of experience, and so I think part of that was, why would I meet with you? And just to encourage you, when you're a church planter, regardless of your age, unless you've been around for a while and you're pretty experienced, like you're still new to the people that are coming to the church. And so how they view you is kind of different. So like, for example, somebody walks through the doors for the first time now. New City's been around for 6 years. We're established. Our Sunday mornings, when you walk in, it's like, oh, they've been around for a while. Newer people are more likely to ask me to meet than when we just planted, because we were new. Like there wasn't this kind of like, I don't know how I'm trying to say this. Like respect is not the right word, but like cachet that they kind of gave you all automatically. Not that you deserve it as the pastor, but like they're just you're viewed a certain way.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's a brand new, there's not a lot of people or whatever, they kind of I don't know.
It's like they're waiting it out, and so they don't want to like. Am I going to talk to this guy, and then like a month later, everything he said is null and void because he's not there anymore.
I think it's like how legit is this person. So anyway, one of the things I would recommend is I would be even today. I mean, even now I do this now, but especially in the beginning, I would be very proactive about meeting with your people, reaching out. Even if your church isn't very large, people just assume that people are busy. Like. Every time I go out of my way, somebody says, "Hey, I know you're busy." I'm like, "I'm not busy." And sometimes people kind of like stare at me, but I'm like, "I'm not busy. Like this is my job. I will make time. I'll figure it out. It doesn't mean I can meet tomorrow, but we will figure this out." Be proactive. So we've talked about I use something called Calendly, which I just email people, said, "Hey, I'd love to meet." Spend time on my calendar, and then I'll pick a place. And so like it doesn't even have to be like something to talk about. It could just be like, hey, how you doing? And checking in on people. But be very proactive on your end of getting together, meeting people so that they see that you actually mean it and that you actually quote unquote have the time and you're not too busy. But I would be very proactive about meeting with your people. And that's something I would recommend myself when I was younger. I just kind of assumed everybody wants to meet with you. And that's not really the case, especially when it's a brand new church plant. So be proactive about that.
So we showed a video yesterday of we recorded a bunch of people saying, what's one way that New City has impacted your life while you've been here?
We do that every anniversary.
Yeah, every anniversary. So this is the first year I put the video together.
Yeah.
So I mean, we had it was longer than I anticipated, but it was good. Probably had about like 25 or so different people that were willing, that weren't. Some were camera shy. Yeah. You'll get that. But a couple of them were just, I appreciated one thing about Dylan was just wanting to have coffee with me just to see how I'm doing. So when you be proactive about meeting people, it's not always because there's a problem.
Right.
It's, and a lot of time, this might be a little ministry hack, one that my brother had shared with me. It's like, if you are there for people when they really need it, you won't have to so much check in on them as much. Like, not that you want to, but when you're there, when they need you, they always know you're going to be there,
right.
And so it's just more of a way of like, you think you're going to have to meet with people all the time, but when you meet with them in the important moments, that might be the one time you talk to them every 6 months or something like that, but it's the most impactful time.
And it doesn't have to be even once every so often is fine. I would also say this, one of the things that's frustrating is probably not the right way. I would just say frustrating about ministry is that when people ask, and you can probably understand this if you're pastor or ministry leader, someone wants to meet with you and they don't tell you why. And it's like, it's just so stressful. Like, are they upset about something? Is things going fine? And, it just stinks. And so I would recommend on your end, when you reach out to people, you should tell them why. Like, hey, like I say this to people, I've got no agenda. I just want to see how you're doing. And I really think sometimes people think like they're in trouble or whatever. And I think that can help too. And so if you're just like reaching out, then tell them why. I also think it's helpful too, because, leading a ministry, you're asking people to serve and to give and to do things to help the church be what it needs to be. And so it is really nice when you're not asking something from somebody, when you can just like hang out with them and be there with them. And so I think that's helpful on their end too, that when you are asking, it's like, oh, the only time I hear from him or from her is when she or he wants something from me. And I think that can be helpful too. So I'd be really proactive about it. Again, I mentioned before, Calendly, you can get the free version. You can connect it to your Google Calendar or probably other calendars if you use something other than Google, and it automatically knows when you're available, when you're not, and you can say only, these times I can be available on certain days. And it just makes it super easy. There's no back and forth. People almost always, hardly ever did somebody not pick a time on my calendar. I would say this, I think it's helpful that New City's established, been around for a while. Some of our people have been here for years. Again, if we were newer, I think I might have to be a little more flexible with my calendar than I am now, if that makes sense, because there's no relationship there. They don't really know me. They're not really going to like go out of their way to do it. And also it depends on where you live. We live in Raleigh, so there's a lot of work from home, flexible schedules. But I think that's increasingly the case everywhere.
Yeah.
And so don't just assume people can't meet before. Don't assume that people can only meet before 9 a.m. or after 5 p.m. A lot of people can meet during the day if you just give them some heads up. So
it's funny you mentioned that about it's a funny story about letting them know what you're wanting to meet with them for, because we had someone who had just started coming. His fiance actually just got baptized yesterday as of this recording. And I believe I had asked to meet with him for breakfast, and then immediately after, Dylan had asked to meet with him. He's like, am I in trouble? Am I being kicked out of the church or something? Because none of us were like didn't really say why we were going to meet for him. I was just like, hey, we'd like to meet. And that was it. So he just had to speculate the entire time before we met. I bet you he was just a nervous wreck.
Well, I will say, I did mention.
Did you? Okay.
I just want to get to know you better.
All right, I did not.
But regardless, he's completely new to church. Yep. No background experience. And so Brian, who's his community group leader and runs group, and then Dylan, who's the pastor, the same week, both me and he thought, I remember him telling me he thought he was in trouble.
He's like, this is why I stayed away from church.
Yeah. But it's like, I think it's also cool too, because people also don't expect it. So it's a little surprise and delight. And so, especially, I would say this, especially if you're newer and smaller, be very proactive, even about new people. If they give you their Connect card, they're willing.
Yes.
Now, for us, I kind of wait like 2 weeks. I make sure someone comes back twice. We're the size where you can tell pretty much pretty easily if someone's their second time. We've got 2 services now, so that makes it easier too. And so I'll wait. If they give us some information, I'll wait till the second week, and then I'll be very proactive, especially especially with the men, about, hey, let's get together. And then we have a woman here who's not on staff, but she meets with some of the women, which is really helpful too. But I would say if you're newer or if you're like desperate's not the right word, but yeah, you want to reach more people, the church is smaller, even after the first week, just say, hey, I'm so-and-so. They probably heard you preach, even if you didn't really talk to them, and say, hey, I'm, pastor or whatever. Even if you're not lead pastor, it doesn't matter. Just say, I'd love to get to know you more. I hear about your story. Here's my calendar. If you're willing to meet, let me know. And a lot of times people say yes to that. Not everybody responds, but a lot of them do. And so I just found too, if I meet with them, there's a high probability they're going to come back and get and stick. So be very proactive about that. Even if they're brand new, just say, hey, if they fill out Connect, if they fill out a Connect card, then they're kind of expecting to hear something. Yeah. And especially this day and age, like people are decreasingly going to church casually because they want to be there or something's going on in their life. And especially if they give you their information, like they're probably fine. They'll either ignore you or they'll say yes, but they're not going to be upset that you asked to meet. Especially because I just don't think a lot of people are used to someone just wanting to hear about them, about how their lives. So be proactive about meeting with your people. It's a big thing. Number 3, be conscious about time with your family. So one of our, staff values here is like we talk about working hard and resting well and going slower so that you can make it for the long haul. And so, for me, like one of my dreams and desires is like when my kids get older and they're teenagers about to move out of the house, like I want them to be able to say, I never thought my dad loved the church more than he loved me. And so there's I do like one, not that you have to do this, but my kids are younger. So like once a month, I'll take them out like on a little date, just one-on-one, or we'll like try to be intentional. Like we're going to the zoo this week because it's spring break. And I mean, years ago, I probably would have been a little bit more, I would say, unwise in this area. But now it's like take advantage of the time with our kids. I mean, I know that I'll never regret 20 years from now spending time with my family. Now, obviously, you can't be like taking off all the time, whatever, but that's not my problem. I don't think it's probably your problem either if you're listening to this. I think our problem is we need to, and I think part of this is just the American Western culture of like working hard, even if we're not working hard all the time, but working all the time and trying to produce and trying to take a step back. So I would just, be intentional about the moments and the times that you can, friends, family, relationships that are important to you, make sure they're intentional. I'll talk about this in a second. Like I've got a pastor friend that we meet every other week, and it's like a thing on our calendar. It's 90 minutes. But now like there's no way I wouldn't do it. And it's really helpful because it's an important thing for me to go a little slower so that I can make it for the long haul. And so we talk about this too. One of the strengths of working at a church is your schedule can be a little bit more flexible. And so take advantage of that. I've said in the past, like a lot of times we'll go on vacation, we'll leave Sunday afternoon and come back like Friday. It's oftentimes a little bit cheaper because it's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday nights are always cheaper wherever you go. And so being creative about that, but really being intentional of like, hey, do I have anything scheduled this month or within the next 2 months that's with my family or with my kids or something like that. I'm glad I'm doing it now, and I would have been even more intentional about it back in the beginning if I had thought of these things better.
So I just have my sister nearby, not married, don't have kids, got dogs. But my parents are in Virginia, my brother's down south further. Yeah. And so for me, that's a little easier to balance. I have some close friendships, so I kind of look at that as family. But this is speaking primarily, I think with Dylan is that that immediate family.
But in your context too, I mean, friendships count too. I mean,
they do. They kind of like get you, in that between stage. So I do prioritize them. But cool thing is a lot of those friends I'm also in a certain way mentoring as well, and having them also feed into me. So kind of 2 birds with the same stone. But one thing I would emphasize is you may not have, the reason Dylan, I think, a lot of times can do this is, eventually as you get more people on staff, you feel that you can leave stuff in their hands. Perhaps you're the only one that's on staff right now. Mm-hmm. Your church will be fine. Do not think because I'm the only one here who else is going to do it that you can't spend time with your family. Your church is going to be fine. Try to put into some practice, maybe raising some lay leaders to also help. But I don't want you to fall into that. That is not a viable excuse not to spend time with your families because you're the only one there. So how you go about making sure things are in place for when you do go, that's your context, but I just don't use that as an excuse.
Yeah, a really practical tip on this is that if you put it on your calendar that you're going to be gone or you're going to do this thing, then it will happen and you will figure out a way to make it work. So a lot of times, maybe it's like, we're a smaller church. I'm the only paid full-time staff member, whatever. I can't take a week vacation. Like, there's just no way. And so you just never you wait till the perfect time and you never do it. But if you say, hey, 3 months from now, I'm going to be gone this week, you will figure it out. Yeah. Like you will force yourself to figure it out. So we want to be sympathetic, obviously, to the different sizes and all these sorts of things. But if you just put on your calendar and do it, it will happen. And so I'm talking about the big and small things. So, my wife and I have regular date nights. I do some stuff with my kids. And then we try to do things where we are creating memories together that have nothing to do with church or being at church or anything like that. Just want to be really conscious about that and be proactive about it. If you put on your calendar, it will happen. Don't feel bad about taking some time off. Obviously, if you're taking a lot of time off and not working hard, then you should feel bad. Maybe that doesn't sound Christian. You should feel convicted.
There you go.
But if you are, man, it's okay. Like, it's okay if you don't meet with someone that week. Like, it's okay if you don't. If you're a one-man show, man, maybe you do like a lot of your social media. Like, there are times in the past, because we talk about being very consistent. Like, I would schedule things a week in advance. So the next week. Even after I came back, I didn't schedule everything. So we wouldn't have a lot of social media posts and stuff like that. It's okay if it's a little bit lesser than so that you can get a break and make it. So be conscious about time with your family or the relationships that are important to you because they will not happen by accident. And don't let ministry stop you from that. That also help you last for the long haul as well. Number 3, a fourth reflection is to create weekly rhythms. So again, we talk about these a lot. Whether that's going to bed or getting up in the morning, exercising, time with your family, preaching regularly, or if there's any tasks that you have to do every week that take some time, putting them on the calendar, not just putting them on a checklist of I got to write a sermon this week, or I've got to follow up with all of my community group leaders this week. Because if I have found if something takes longer than 15 minutes or 30 minutes, it needs to be on my calendar as a thing I'm doing, not just a task. So tasks are 5 to 10 minute things I can get done on my task list. I can do it and go to the next one. The things that take longer, they need to be on my calendar to ensure they get done. And I also when I'm doing them, I'm focused because I've designated this time to it. And so recently I've been doing the bedtime. I mean, for a while I've had a consistent bedtime, but I've been trying to get up earlier. So I've been pushing it up a little bit earlier. I'm not. If I was up to me, I would be a midnight. I would go to bed at midnight every night if it was just me. But that's not my season of life. Wife and kids, and anyway, so I've been trying to do some exercise stuff in the morning, and so I've been changing that. It's been really helpful for me. Basically, what you want to have habits, so you're not having to make a decision or relying on your willpower every week to do, to write the sermon or to do the thing that takes a lot of work. It's I don't want to do this. Well, you never want to do it. But if it's just this is just something habitual that I do, then I do it. I was recently, I think I was telling you last week, I was listening to this TED Talk on exercise. And the guy was talking about, it was an older guy who was obviously in shape, healthy, doctor of some sort. And one of the things he mentioned was exercising every day, even in small amounts, is what you should do. He said you should exercise 7 days a week or 6 or whatever. I mean, he wasn't, but a lot, almost every day. He said the problem with going to the gym 3 days a week, which is what my routine was been the last 4 years, which I've got frustrated with. So I'm trying to change it. Remember we talked about jump roping last episode?
That's right. Yep.
I'm still doing it. On the last 2 days,
Get 30 seconds.
Yesterday I only did a minute. I did some other body stretch exercises stuff because my shins and my lower back are hurting. Because when they say to start, you should do 5 minutes every other day, and I've been doing 20 minutes every day. Okay. No, I mean I've been taking breaks. I've been messing up, and so my body's not used to this, and I'm getting older, so you can't just you're not a spring chicken anymore. So and then this morning I did a little bit more, but because I want to do the 20-minute habit every morning, and so I'm trying to do some other stuff. But anyway, he talks about how I think I mentioned this last episode. I don't know why we were talking about last episode, but even 3 times a week, it's well, should I go today? Should I double up tomorrow? I can put this off. I'll do 3 days in a row. You're giving yourself too many options. And so this is where these weekly rhythms come in of here's when I work on the sermon or these sorts of things. Here's when I spend time with my family. Here's when I go to bed. Here's when I wake up. Here's when I do some of these weekly and morning routines, work routines are really, really helpful. And they will help you be less stressed because you're more routine. Like, here's when I do what I'm going to do. Here's what I'm not. I've got various episodes of like how I spend my time if it's helpful, but generally speaking for me, until noon every day, like I know what I'm doing. And then in the afternoons, they're more flexible to meetings. I'll move things around, but there's time every day where I know exactly, hey, I've got time to get these things done. Things will get done by Thursday by the end of the week. And so you want to create weekly rhythms, not just kind of go with the flow, put everything on a checklist and try to get your checklist done by the end of the week. I don't think that's helpful.
Well, I think we talked about jump rope last week because it was avoiding stress, so exercise was the thing. So, I play tennis. It's not as consistent like the days just because of other people's schedules. But for me, what really helps is it's funny hearing grown adults talk about bedtime, because get on your PJs. But it's really
it's the evolution. When you're a kid, you have a bedtime. Then for a while, college years, young adult years, you're like whatever. And then when you get older, you're like, oh, I need to have a bedtime.
It's weird how like I've seen these memes where the things that I dreaded as a child, I look forward to as an adult: bedtime and reading and
nap time,
snack time. But for me, I could probably sleep 10 hours a day, which isn't good, but like I can hibernate. But I can somewhat function off of less. But I'm trying to find this sweet spot. But for me, trying to shut things down, even if you have like just maybe 30 minutes of reflection where you have your tea or whatever you may have before you go to bed, to think about that day has been very helpful for me. And like I said, you set a timer. Even on, if you turn off your phone like Dylan does, set your timer some other way just to hey, stop what you're doing, do this, get in bed, shut your phone off. It's going to be tough at first because, I don't know, when nowadays when you go sleep early or you get off your phone, you feel like life is passing you by and you don't, you get that FOMO.
Well, it's funny. It's so true. And then when you get on your phone in the morning, you're like, oh, this is like nothing happens.
Nothing happened. You look at it and you get like 2 new tweets or something like that. You're like, oh, I just looked and played, some Candy Crush for 3 hours. But anyway, yes, how you spend your time, I think, outside of ministry hours, for lack of a better term, will just terribly affect, and that's not the right word, really, really, really affect. I was trying to come up with a cool vocabulary word, but it will really impact what you do during the day and how you're there for other people.
Well, the sleep thing, because I've read a little bit about it because I don't sleep very well, trying to improve, is, the amount of hours of sleep you need are different. But also, when I talked about this, like, because we feel bad saying we sleep too long because we think it's quote unquote lazy. I think, again, it goes back to rhythms, and that if you plan what you're going to do, you can get way more done in less amount of time. And the people that, like, I've kind of listened to or read some things or heard some interviews about it, they're like, yeah, I'll sleep or be in bed 8 to 9 hours a day. And they're, like, completely unapologetic about it. And these are the same people that do, like, what we would say are very efficient, get a lot done. Because you need to sleep. So for me, I'm in bed about 8.5 hours. I can't operate off 6 hours. Like, I can't. I'll read. Now, some of that's reading because I'll read for about 30 to 45 minutes in bed before I go to bed. But I'm like in my bed about 8.5 hours. I got a new Apple Watch recently, so it's like tells me. So I'm like, yeah, I was like trying to track my sleep a little bit. But like I'm in bed for about 8.5 hours every day. And I don't complain. I'm not like, I think that's better than me sitting on my, better than me saying I'm in bed for 6 hours because I'm on my phone till midnight and then get up at 6 a.m. tired. I've also found, really, when it comes to these rhythms, when you start doing them, you realize you have more time than you think you do. Like if you hear someone who has like all this structure to the day, like how do they get everything done? Well, I think they've prioritized things, and you just like get used to adapting. So, for example, I was talking to, a really well-known pastor who lives in the area like a week ago about his exercise, because he said he walks 100,000 steps a week, and so I was like, can you explain to me how you do this? And then he said, and he was, he's pretty in shape. And he said, this wasn't like a bragging thing. I was just like really fascinated, like how he does this. He goes to the gym 5 days a week, and he's there for 90 minutes. And this guy writes a ton, leads a church. He does a lot of stuff. We would say he's like, quote unquote, very busy. But he does it every week. He works out for 45 minutes, and then he walks on a treadmill for 45 minutes. Now he's like, here's what I do. Here's how I answer emails. Like I use some of the time, but I'm walking the whole time. He's like, I got my 10,000 steps in by 10 a.m. by the time I leave the gym, and then the rest of my walking normally will be fine for us today. But what I thought was so fascinating is like I'm just sitting here listening to him, and I'm like, this is a man that everyone would say was so busy, produces a lot of stuff, a lot of content, and yet goes to the gym 5 days a week. which again shows me that the problem is not a lack of time. The problem is how we spend our time. Now, again, to be clear, different people have different wiring. Some people like to do a ton of stuff. Some people don't want to do as much stuff. So I'm not saying like the ideal is go to the gym every day and produce and write books and preach. Like, I'm not saying that's the ideal. You got to do how you're wiring, how you're gifted, how you want to do. I think part of that is he likes doing a lot of stuff, so it's enjoyable for him. So I'm not saying that's the ideal, but what I am saying is that when you put things on your calendar and do them consistently, they become habits, and then you figure out the time. So even if you're like a 90-minute meeting every other week, I don't really have the time for that. I did have the time for it because I do it now. But it's like, I remember thinking that in the beginning, like, this is important, but like we started for 60 minutes and like we really needed 90 minutes. And it's like, oh, it's just what I do. And I get everything done on the other times, because I know here's when I'm doing all these other things. So weekly rhythms are so important. The less decisions your brain has to make on what to do next, the better. So I don't know. I know that's kind of a long answer, but as you were talking, it made me think of that conversation. I'm like, he's like doing all these things. He goes to gym 5 days a week, and I have no desire to do that. Now, of course, part of it's season of life. He's a little bit older. His kids are older, and so he has. But still, it's just like rhythms that we follow helps us get things done. So that was number 4. Number 5, have a consistent meeting to share ministry and life. And so I'm just a really big proponent of this, especially the longer you're in this and the more people you meet with. I remember like 2 years ago, I was talking to a pastor friend. I ran into him in a local Panera. I've known him since I was a kid. He was like a pastor at the church that I grew up in, and now he's leading another church. And he was about to leave for sabbatical. And I forget exactly how he said it. He actually came, like last summer was in a sabbatical. He came to New City one Sunday too. And he talked about like... I should text him because he phrased it so well. As he was like trying to explain to his people why he was taking a sabbatical, he's like, ministry, it's heavy. You're dealing with a lot of people's stuff and just the grief that other people are going through. And he's like, it's very heavy, but he's like, it's like, I forget how he said, but it's like plates of gold. So he's like the heaviness, but it's like an honor and it's a privilege and it's amazing. It's just after a while, you've got to take the backpack off and rest. And so I think that's helpful is that even in the interim, these short times, that we've got to have places where we can do that. And so, like, for example, my friend and I, he's a pastor as well. We meet every other week. We just, like, it's not like a complaining session. Sometimes it's like we don't really have a lot of bad stuff to talk about. Sometimes there are heavy things. And it's just been so refreshing to have an outlet of someone who's not at your church and who doesn't know the people at your church. It's not even the problem that it's at your church, but there's sometimes you just want to talk about something with somebody who doesn't know anyone involved, so that there's not any issues there. It's not like someone at your church you don't trust. It's just like, it's just easy to do that. And someone that can relate to you, you can relate to them. So whether it's a friend, whether it's a counselor, I would not recommend this. I mean, your spouse is great. I don't think your spouse should, quote unquote, count for this. You need to have someone just outside of everything consistently. There's been some, I'll mention it too, this next point. We're 6 years in, so it's not a ton of time, but it's a little bit of time. And with Acts 29, some of the assessments that I do a couple of those a year. And so I've assessed, a good number of church planners now. So I've begun to see certain rhythms and things that commonalities between those who do well and seem to last a while and those who don't. And one of those is having consistent outlets of ministry, people in ministry or friends that get what's going on, and that you can talk through things. And so I just figure out what that is. I mean, I didn't have that in the beginning, and I was like, didn't really need it necessarily, but after a while you're going to need it, and it's best to figure it out before it's too late. And so having a consistent meeting at some point with somebody to share what's going on, even if you feel like you don't need it, will help you in the long run. Especially like there's just times where like you're just like frustrated or you're just really discouraged, and leaving the conversation, you just feel better. And it's like, I would have been fine if I didn't have this conversation, but now I feel better. I feel lighter. I feel encouraged. It's really easy for us to get discouraged about the stuff that's going on at our churches, but to have someone's outside perspective and be like, that's really awesome. Like, we're thinking about all the things we wish were different. And like, but this is like really cool that this happened, and you should celebrate that. And it's like, oh yeah, that's good. Like, I should celebrate that. And so it can be really helpful. So
yeah, I would say this is something that's very important, so that you don't unintentionally build up resentment for things that you're like, oh, this isn't a big deal. Maybe I had this conversation with my sister earlier, like, talking about things out loud. Sometimes you realize, okay, I'm being a little crazy about this. And the other times you're like, no, this is a legit complaint, or you just need to voice it. So you're like, okay, no, I'm the one that's being a little sensitive about this, or no, I actually should bring this up. And sometimes you just can't process that unless you're talking to somebody else that is, objective, that's away from the situation. So it is helpful, even like as Dylan said, you may not had a bad week or a bad month, but still have those conversations, because you could uncover some stuff that slowly would maybe eat away at you over time that you didn't see was there. So it's almost like, I want to say it's therapy without being therapy in that sense.
Yeah.
Someone that kind of knows more how you tick and how you operate and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's really helpful too because you'll start to say things over time that someone else could be like, "Hey, you say this a lot. Like, I don't know if you mentioned this, or you I've heard you complain about this area," or like it's just like, "Oh wow, that's a good point. Like, I should do something with that." So, having some sort of consistent meeting place where you can be honest about where things are going. You may not feel like you need it, but you will at some point. Especially if you've been in this for a while, you probably are like, yes. And if you're newer, you're probably like, maybe you will need it and you'll be glad that you have it. So, and I would just recommend everybody wants this. And so it might take you being intentional, be like, hey, maybe the first time you meet with a pastor or whatever in the area, friend, like you don't have to say like, hey, we're going to set up some official thing. Just get together. If it was fun, say, hey, do it again. And then just be like, hey, would you be interested in doing this? Like, I need a friend that I can be honest with. Somebody has to take the lead in doing that or otherwise it won't happen. So maybe that should be you. And then last but not least, the sixth reflection as New City Church turns 6 is that you cannot compensate for a lack of spiritual practices or disciplines or whatever you want to call them. Again, this is something I've increasingly picked up on. And, New City's been around for a while, so I've just seen it in my own life. The people that do well over the long haul, like this stuff matters. Like they could tell you, what do I do to help me stay close to Jesus? They could tell you, not just like, well, I kind of read my Bible sometimes or I pray. Like, here's exactly what I do. Now, what you could do could change, and it could look different in different seasons. I get really frustrated with myself. I'm someone that likes things to be different, and so after a few months, I get really tired of the same thing, which I get really frustrated because it's like I just wish I could keep doing this because then I got to figure out something else. I'm not the same way with food. Like, I'm not a food guy. But like I know people that like they'll eat the same breakfast for years, and I'm like, after a month, I got to do something different. Like I just can't. But anyway, it needs to be intentional. Even go back to the workout thing. Like I shouldn't say it needs to be every day, but it needs to be like something you're not thinking of and doing it very consistently. The people that have a strong devotional life. I mean, ministry is hard. Obviously, we're trying to lead people to love Jesus, and if we don't love Jesus, then that's going to be hard to do. One of the questions I like to ask myself is, would I want someone else to follow Jesus the way that I'm following Jesus? Not just in how I live, but even in my personal time with the Lord and what that looks like. So to me, it'll change up a little bit every few months, but it's like, it's consistent. It's on the calendar. There's some things I do every day and some things I do like once a month. But the guys that do well, like it's interesting. Having a consistent devotional discipline life doesn't necessarily mean you're going to preach well or going to lead well. Like it doesn't mean you necessarily have skills in all these other areas, but it's like, if you don't have those other areas, it just kind of comes through. And so not to mean you're going to be like an amazing leader or amazing preacher, but you will be better, and you will certainly be a better preacher if you actually believe what you're saying, as opposed to like when you get time, you just kind of do it. And so like for me, it's like it's not necessarily like on my calendar, but I know when I'm doing it every single day and it's happening. And being super consistent with that, you cannot replace that, and it will absolutely catch up with you. And so my recommendation is, the newer your church is, maybe the more quote-unquote free time you have, maybe lack of a better word, you need to put on the calendar. Now it goes back to like these regular rhythms, because once it's on there, you'll just figure out everything else around it. But trying to fit it in later, you might feel like it's harder than it needs to be because it wasn't a consistent habit that you had, going into everything.
There's a big difference between finding time and making time. To where if you're trying to find time for some spiritual disciplines, more than likely you'll plug in something else for that. But if you make time for it, as Dylan says, and you plan everything else around that, I think you're going to find more success.
Yeah.
But also keep in mind that when you talk about preaching or teaching or anything like that, giving your best does not mean you're awesome or you're going to be like the next such and such pastor. That really just means what you have, the skills and the talents God is giving you with the time that He's giving you, you're maximizing that to the best of your ability. And it may not be like a top tier sermon that people talk about 20, 30 years from now, but you need to know that you were a good steward of what God gave you and the time that God gave you. That's being obedient. That's being successful, and not that your sermon was talked about, or went viral. That's irrelevant.
Yeah.
So just don't be discouraged as you're starting to do some of these spiritual practices that you don't, have it fine-tuned right away, or don't compare yourself to other people. It's very easy to do that. You can look up to others as mentors, but like, I would like to achieve that according to my own rhythms, but give yourself a little bit of grace, but also just start doing it.
Yep.
You know.
Yeah, you want to show up every day. That's what it is. You want to show up and get in the habit of practice. It's okay. Like some days for me, it feels like work. Some days for me, it's shorter than it maybe quote unquote should be. But I'm just doing it. It's like this is like a non-negotiable. This is something that I just do, whether I feel like it or not, whether I have a lot of time or not. Like some days, ironically, I'll spend more time on my weekdays doing it than on my days off, even though I would technically have more free time. But it's fine. I still show up and I still do it. Another thing is maybe doing it with other people can help you, whether you've got a group of guys or a group of people that you're doing with, and like holding each other accountable, because that will help you even in the days you don't feel like doing it, and even if you like you rush through it. At least you did it, and it just is like it eventually will come to a place where this is just what I do. But it's okay if you need help getting there, and having other people with you as well, because it just you won't last. And when life gets difficult, when ministry gets difficult, you've got to actually believe and trust this stuff. And it's hard to believe and trust Jesus and His Word if we're not spending time with Him. And so, you cannot compensate for a lack of spiritual practices. I've seen it time and time again in my own life, and especially in other pastors. There's no substitute for it. So, those are 6 church planting reflections as New City Church turns 6. I hope that was helpful. Again, if you're on Facebook, we're on the Practical Church Planting Facebook group. So you make sure you can join the group, ask questions. People are talking all the time. So we've got ministry questions. You can check that out. And thanks for being with us. We'll be with you next week on Practical Church Planting.
Later days.